Hi, this is Dan Coffin, and I'm the owner of SPNC Corp. And we had a request from several people to try and get some of this annual meeting that we did recently here in February around the 15th out on the internet so people could see some of the information for a second time. And I have decided to try and do a Zoom meeting here for you today. So I'm going to go through the slide deck, a PowerPoint that was on there, and give you the information that was on there briefly. Won't be nearly into the depth that we did, just because we don't have a live audience. But I wanted to make sure that as you could see some of these pieces of the puzzle, somewhat with the chemistry and some of the basic soils, that people could actually be able to begin to formulate in their minds what we do here at SPNC. So the annual meeting was, the question was, what's really going on out there? I think a lot of this has been decided upon with the craziness of the fertilizer industry because of the worldwide turmoil. But guys are asking themselves, okay, are things going to back off on price? No, it doesn't appear at this point anything's going to back up on price. The prices continue to go up. And so as people are questioning extremely high costs for potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, with the agronomy that's in here, and understanding the agronomy, the crops and soils, and the return on investment that they have to get, what kind of things could they begin to look at and decide upon? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this into two sections. The first section about halfway through, and then the second section I'll make a separate recording so that you don't have to listen to 4 hours of me carrying on. And so at the end, I'll stop a section and then ask for questions. And you can ask the questions basically through email or call us directly. So the meeting agenda we had was basically coming through some of these pieces where we're talking about chemistry, a little bit of microbials and the plant for this particular portion, so we won't spend time here. Just quickly, for those of you who may be watching it for the first time who don't know anything about us, we are an agricultural business. The picture in the right-hand corner is just agriculture. That's not our place, but the picture in the upper right-hand corner is our place. We're a group of about 6 employees, have multiple different suppliers that we use their basic information and their products to be able to create our own products, as well as a few products that we created ourselves. And this year we did make some changes at our plant. This is the original building that we started with back in 2015. And the changes that we put to the plant this year, last year we had 4 4,900 gallon tanks and a small mixing unit there to be able to mix in the products to go into blends, whether they be starters or foliars or any custom blend things we do. This year we have 8 of those tanks sitting now side by side, and an additional 3 3000s and a 2500 beside them. So a great percentage of the interior of our warehouse now is helping us to be able to put in products for the winter. On the other side of that wall, to the left on the other side, is actually 3 30,000 gallon tanks that we have for 24/6, to 10,500 gallon cone bottoms that we put specialty products in that we can actually store out for the winter. And then we also have an additional 2 30,000 gallon tanks over at North Manchester, Indiana, where we have more 6/24/6. So our business is expanding rapidly, and we have become basic in a lot of different things, as well as a hub for things like boron and zinc, manganese, a lot of the micronutrients, as well as biostimulants. This is our original office, as I said, from 2015. We just recently purchased another location. So we have a second office, and it's going to be warehousing. And fortunately for us, they happen to be right beside each other. And so we're actually a mile east of the Fort Wayne Airport at 10603 and 10617 Magic, and that's spelled with a J, MAJIC, Magic Port Lane, just 1 mile east of the Fort Wayne Airport in Fort Wayne. So we're going to start off with chemistry today, and the little picture says, "Hey, let's start off hard." I told the guys, let's make this hard and get the hard stuff out of the way. And I kind of do that tongue in cheek, but chemistry, if you've never had any of it, chemistry at all, it is hard to understand, but it's not as difficult as we might think. And so chemistry is plainly just magnetism and electricity. We think of a magnet, one end being positive, one end being negative. And, if we turn those in and touch each other, they attract. So, the negatives and the positives attract. If they're both negatives, they repel each other. I actually put out an information sheet that we passed out in the meeting, so that guys had some cheat sheets. And I'll hit this real quick and then we'll go back to that. But this was a cheat sheet that I put out. A lot of people have never seen the elements. They don't understand that there are different names for those elements that are represented by letters. and then that there's an actual physical charge on each one of these different elements. So for instance, carbon at the top on the left has a 4- charge. One carbon atom has a 4- charge. A hydrogen ion, which is, again, we call acid hydrogen, just H, it has a plus charge. So you could imagine if this was a chemistry set or a magnetism set, I could take 4 hydrogens and attach them to that carbon, and the carbon's net charge then would be satisfied. So four pluses around a 4- element would be CH4, which is actually methane. So pluses and minuses in this whole big picture is really what this is all about. And when you begin to see that some of the products that we make, on the right side, there are compounds. You have different compounds, and I've put the letters there beside them for the pieces of the puzzle. And then on the far right-hand side, the terms, I'll use terms like maybe carbohydrates or sugars, monosaccharides, which is just a single sugar. There's a lot of different things here. So if at any point, if you can print these things off at home if they'll print from this. If not, you'll have this for a reference. But this helps figure a few things out for us. Down to the bottom side of the right sheet, you'll see cation, CEC, anion, base saturation, parts per million. Those are terms that you might have heard before. And it kind of helps us understand that if a cation is just a positively charged ion, so for instance, if I went back to the left side there at hydrogen, that's a 1+. Since it has a plus charge, it's called a cation. And if it's a cation, then it can stick to the soil. And a cation exchange capacity is just adding up how many cations that soil could hold. Just some simple things. But because we don't get to talk about them much, we don't get to understand them very well. So it's basically pluses and minuses that repel and attract. Some things mix together very easily, and some things don't. And that's just the way it is. So sometimes when we have that attraction, they all stay as liquids. Sometimes when they have that attraction, they turn to solids. And if you've ever seen the cottage cheese in the tank mix that you might have made in a tank, for instance, where you have calcium and phosphate or magnesium and phosphate or iron and phosphate, it makes an insoluble cottage cheese. And we laugh about that and then realize the pain and agony we go through to get it out. Why? Formulation weight. How much physical weight can stay in a gallon of water, in a gallon of material before it's falling out? And it's somewhere typically around the mid-12s to a 13-pound. You're getting about as much as you can get. And then when you just put a little bit too much more in there, bam, all those salts will form and they'll fall out. So it may just be simple from the simple weight of the product will fall out. And then again, we go back to the chemical nature, what mixes and what doesn't. So salting out or falling out is a reality. When you're mixing stuff on the farm, oftentimes guys are like, hey, we're ordering 4 products. Just put all 4 of those products together in the tote and then we'll put it into the water. Boy, don't we wish it worked that way, because we've even made a few errors from time to time when we did that, when things just get to either be too much salt, too much weight, or something that actually is capable of staying in solution for a short period of time, sits there for days or a week or 2 weeks, and it just basically turns to something else and falls out. So we have to know what we're doing. So what is the charge on phosphorus? And what does it like to attract? Well, if you go to your sheet there and you look at it, you'll find out that the charge on phosphorus is a -3. That means it has 3 electrons floating around. It has a -3 charging. And so if it's actually negatively charged, what does it like to attract itself to? Well, it attracts to something that's positive. So what happens in the solution when are going to be attracted to Mr. Phosphorus here. And when they actually bind to the phosphorus then starts doing this thing of not staying as a liquid. It starts to turn to a solid. And in a test tube, if we were doing this in a laboratory or in a flask, when it starts to turn to a solid and it starts falling out, we call that precipitation. Now, that's not rain, same name, but not the same thing, but falling out of solution. So precipitation is rain falling from the sky. But it's also solids forming in a solution and falling down to the bottom of the tank or the bottom of the test tube or the bottom of the flask. So once these insoluble compounds form, it's nearly impossible to fix some of these. Now, I say nearly impossible. Some things can easily be fixed by changing the chemistry in the tube. But when we get into a tank situation, and you would have to use some pretty fancy chemistry, once you know you've made cottage cheese in a tank, you typically know it's about over. There are some things we can fix, but very few things that are possible. So once you make it, it's like, well, once we have this problem happening, we don't want to talk about this anymore. So it's the nature of phosphorus to do some of these things when it mixes with other things. And so if this is the nature of phosphorus, that when it attaches to some of these cations, that it begins to fall out in solution. Well, this only happened to phosphorus when it's in the tank. The reason I ask that question is because if out as a liquid, would the same thing happen on the ground as happened in that test tube? The answer obviously is yes. And if they were available in the soil and I slather this thing up with lots and lots of phosphate, what happens? Well, those elements, when they find that P, that phosphorus, whether it's from manure or excessive lots and lots of phosphorus fertilizer, liquid or dry phosphate that actually melts in the rain and then turns to liquid, what happens? Exact same thing. And so now everything is hard and solid in the soil, and we have deactivated the phosphorus and deactivated the micronutrient that it attached to. So they're now both in the unavailable form. So when we said it's simply magnetism and electricity, how can we avoid some mixing problems with chemicals like phosphorus? Well, it's a term called chelation. And so one of the things we do very readily here is we make phosphorus solutions that have phosphorus and a lot of these nutrients in there. And you're just saying, well, you just told me that it can't be done. How are you working this magic? Is this alchemy or something? No, it's not really. What we do is we use a term called chelation or chelate. Now, you many times have heard of EDTA, and you have a partial picture of what EDTA looks like here. It's a fairly large molecule. And the M in the middle stands for a metal. And you can see that basically the charges that are out here, there's some negative charges on this chelate. That's the Greek word for claw. And so what you're looking at is an organic backbone molecule with carbons on it. And it has some of these oxygens that are present. And basically it provides the ability to take, let's say, for instance, if we took about calcium a while ago, a calcium which has a 2+ ion, and we hold it inside this structure, this chelated structure, the charges are met by the chelate for the calcium ion, and it's held kind of in there inside of it. And it binds it fairly strongly. You can do this with a lot of things. You can do it with calcium. You can do it with potassium. You can do it with magnesium. You can do it with copper, zinc, and iron. You can do it with a lot of different things. And that metal will be held inside that bond until we throw it, when we throw it into the tank with phosphorus. And since it's held in there, the phosphorus can't get to that M, that metal in the center, and nothing happens. It's completely protected. EDTA used to be economical, and typically up until the last year or two, it was really economical. But now, because ETA is a part of the international trade situation, especially with China and India and several other countries, the prices have gone through the roof because of tariffs, because of the problems with the supply chain. And so we have all kinds of issues where in some cases, the economics has changed on EDTA, and some of the other ones actually become a little less costly. It just also allows us to mix the micros and the calcium into phosphate solutions. This interacts well with the soil and the plant because once this gets into the soil, it can be absorbed by the root, the EDTA brought into the plant, and the plant knows how to disrupt this EDTA, break it open, and get to the element inside. And so as a result, it can actually move through the plant. The plant can say, move it here, open it up, take the metal out, use the metal, and then the chelate moves on. The chelate in this particular situation is still intact, and sometimes it can actually find something inside the plant to tie up, and oftentimes it does, and it's oftentimes calcium, and sometimes you can pull a little calcium from the plant when you use some of these EDTAs, but it's not a really bad situation, and it's been widely used for years. Now, in the last 15 or 20 years, amino acid chelates have hit the market, and they've really done a marvelous job for us, because where we said a while ago that EDTA stays in one piece and actually can sometimes grab something else and fill itself up. The beauty of amino acids is you've heard that that's a word of life. An amino acid is a building block for a protein. It's something that plants make and utilize all the time, as well as us. We make amino acids. We eat amino acids, and we can make a few things like that. But plants use amino acids for energy and for nitrogen movement and for a lot of different things, building blocks for proteins and enzymes and things like that. The beauty of amino acids is they're very small, and the M that you see in the middle of this is that same metal. So when I take two amino acids of each other, they're close to each other, and when they get close to each other, they can hold that metal in the middle. So a chelate is formed just like we did on EDTA. The beauty of this is because plants recognize amino acids first and foremost, you can put them on foliar or on the roots, and they're absorbed very, very rapidly. They have an improved plant utility. They provide many other building blocks for the plant. So if the plant takes the metal out and keeps the amino acids, they can keep that amino acid, or they can tear it apart and use it for different things. The chelation is not quite as strong as EDTA, which is nice because it allows that plant to break this down easier. And then once it's broke down, the plant decides what it wants to do with it. And if chosen, it can completely consume that amino acid to use it itself in the plant. So you give the plant the metal that you want, and you give it energy and a little extra nitrogen. It's not needed in high concentrations to work as well. So it works as good or better in lower concentrations than the EDTA ever did. And in the past, it's been a higher cost material. So it's blended in with EDTA to get the EDTA, to get more metal in there and keep the cost down. This year, however, in many cases, the EDTA is as expensive, if not more expensive than the combination. In some cases, the combination of the amino acids along with EDTA is actually cheaper just because you're using less EDTA. So here at the plant at SPNC, we offer several different products that allow you to assist with the choices that you may be making. So we have starter, that's 24% phosphate. And in that phosphate, 80% of that 24% phosphate is already in the form that's available to the plant. We call it the ortho form. And so we make a lot of different blends for a lot of different people. And I use the 624-6 not because it's the most magical, it is the most economical and does the best job for the money spent. We use weak chelates, or if we use weak chelates or complexes like some simple compound, let's say iron sulfate. And if we put those weak chelates or those complexes into these mix sulfate happen to come apart now and the iron is floating around in the solution, in a phosphate solution, what's going to happen? The same thing we talked about a while ago. It's going to start turning to cottage cheese. And of course, this case, it's dark brown or black because iron sulfate or iron phosphate is an ugly situation. So we try to tell people, be careful what you ask for. If you want something that's very inexpensive, you might get it. And what happens is if you use products that from a jug and you pour them into your phosphate solution, and it says derived from sulfates on the package. So if you had manganese sulfate or iron sulfate or copper sulfate, and you pour those into solution, if there's any water in there and those sulfates come apart and those ions start floating around, the copper, the manganese, and the iron, you're going to have phosphates that are going to find those, and you're going to start getting all kinds of problems going on in that tank. Even though it may not last for very long, if you can get it out of there, you might have survived the problem, but it's going to happen. So once dissolved, those chemicals are interacting, and the insoluble phosphates are going to form. So you got to be very, very careful with these situations. On the upper right, plant right micro mixes such as corn mix or the broadleaf micro mix are 100% chelated and built to blend with phosphate in the starter. So everything that we typically put together in here is going to be done from a chelate. The rhizosphere that we have has micronutrients and it goes into phosphate solutions. It's completely chelated. All the individual plant right micros are completely chelated. We don't sell sulfates in here just because we never know where they're going to end up going, and we don't want people having these problems out here. Now, in the soil, the EDTA chelation alone is fine, and it's been preferred over time because of cost. However, if we use the amino acid chelates, which we call dual chelation, and we have them this year, the cost changes have actually made them as good or better for price. And as a result, the amino acids are picked up easier. So for instance, if you used a quart of EDTA in the past in the soil, you could probably either use a pint or 3 pints, a pint or a pint and a half of the amino acid chelates and get the same or better results, because more actual chelate. So if let's say it was zinc, more zinc would get into the plant if you use the amino acid chelate, and you don't have to use as much. So you could use 24 ounces instead of using 32. And with the cost changes, it might actually be much less costly. Phosphate is actually more soluble in acidic solutions or conditions. So that's how they react to make it for you, to make it for you at the manufacturing plant. They take phosphorus that's kind of insoluble, treat it with acid, and the acid makes it soluble. And so down in South Florida, for instance, they'll take a ton of calcium phosphate, which is teeth and bones, react it with a ton of sulfuric acid, and it makes a triple super liquid. And then they dry that down into a solid, or they can do it, they can use it in many different ways. But they use sulfuric acid to do this. So a very acidic solution will make phosphate fix itself. So even if you did make some situation like cottage cheese in your tank, if you could really acidify it, you can actually make that go away. But that takes a lot of acid, and it's very dangerous. So does anybody know which element we are talking about when we say the term acid? Now, if you go back to your cheat sheet, if you remember a while ago, we talked about hydrogen. Hydrogen is a simple part of something common that we call H2O, water. Two hydrogens bonding to an oxygen makes water. In this particular case, sulfuric acid, because if you look at your cheat sheet, you'll see over to the right, one of the cheat sheets says sulfate. Sulfate is S with 4 oxygens around it, and it has a 2- charge. So if it has a 2- charge, to make things perfectly fit, 2 hydrogens with a 2+, each with a 1+ charge, would marry up to that and make a compound. So sulfuric acid in this case is H2SO4, sulfuric acid. So if we add some things that are acidic or form acids in our starters, what is the impact on phosphorus in or near where that solution is present? So what I'm getting at is, if we use acidic fertilizers or acid forming fertilizers in the soil, if there is insoluble phosphorus in the soil, and we acidify around that phosphorus, we acidify that zone, that phosphorus melts. And lo and behold, we used chemistry to release phosphorus in the soil. And so we go back, we see that we have the H2SO4. If we have, see on the right side of the left sheet, see sulfate, yeah, 2-. And so when we put the 2- and the 2 hydrogens together, we make H2SO4. And so we use the same chemistry, the same screwy chemistry that we don't understand. We use the same chemistry to work in solutions, in soils. The chemistry is chemistry. And as long as these chemicals can react with each other, the chemistry happens. So if we go into the soil and use things that form sulfates or sulfuric acid, or put acid into the solutions, what's the impact on the phosphorus availability? If we have a more acidic soil, or let's say we haven't limed for years and the pH is down into the 5s or mid 5s or low 5s, it's funny, we go to the soil test and wow, there's more phosphorus in our soil. That's because the acidic conditions are making it more available. Is there anything else you've heard of that can make acids other than just chemicals? Well, certain things, biological things. Life makes acids oftentimes. So microbes make acids, we make acids in our body, we can make some acids, animals make acids, but microbes specifically can make acids. Well, if microbes can make acids, one of the statements I've made for years and people don't understand is 90% of the phosphate in plants passes through biology to get inside it. So 90% of your phosphate comes from biology, and people scratch their head and like, I just don't understand that. Well, understand that if they make enzymes as well as acids, they melt the phosphorus out of some of these insoluble compounds in the soil for you if you have the right microbes. And lo and behold, they're doing it right around these tiny little hair roots right near the area where plants are digging around, and they can pick it up. So is that a lot of chemistry or what? You should have seen the eyes of the people at the meeting. It is a lot of things to pick up on. But with that little bit of background, I want to take you into a soil situation, understand a little bit how soil is built, because it takes some of these same pieces of chemistry that help you realize what's going on. So with a little chemistry under your belt, you may be able to understand some of these soil basics. So soil is a blend of sand, silt, and clay of various sizes and quantities. And if you think of sand being, a really insoluble compound, it's built of silica, along with some aluminum and some other things, some oxygen. But the rocks and minerals that are breaking, that are in the sand, are breaking down all the time into smaller and smaller aggregates from weathering and also biological activity. And eventually, those heavy rocks become sand and sandy pieces, and then further degrade from sand down into silt, smaller molecules, and then into clay, very small platy molecules. And as these aggregates become smaller, they develop larger surface areas. So sand looks like a picture. If you looked at it on a microscope, it looks like the picture of a moon with a lot of craters in it. Where silt looks like, and I'll show you a picture in a few minutes of just like a flat plate with holes in it. And then clays are actually very, very tiny pieces of very fine silicate. It looks like almost sheets of things. And I'll show you a little bit how this works. But they develop surface area. And as a result, there's charge on the surface area, and they release elements from the surfaces, and they begin to develop more electrical charge even within these plates that we're talking about. So the plant or the soil eventually develops a very strong negative charge and holds the cations, the positively charged things. That's why we call it cation exchange capacity. As the elements that are in here now, we're talking about the potassiums and the calciums and magnesiums and such, as they're floating around in solution, they find their way into the plates of smaller particles that are developing. So as clays begin to form, sometimes these elements get stuck inside these clay plates. We call these clay plates aluminosilicates or clays. And so sometimes their charges are met evenly, and then sometimes there's too much charge on something. And so if there's lots and lots of cations like potassium and calcium and magnesium and manganese and such, and they're stuck on the inside, that clay develops a strong negative charge. It's like it got way too many positives on the inside charge of it. So it's wanting to attract negative charges or positive charges either way, in some cases, to be able to make itself even out the charge. So that's where we get the charge in the soil, and that's why things sticks to it. So as the plates develop, sometimes those elements will substitute inside the clay structures, and the battery of magnetism develops. So when they're stuck inside, and I'll show you the pictures here in a couple minutes, and hopefully it'll make it a little clearer for you. Here's a couple pictures. This is sand near the ocean. That's the one on the left. That's from Sand Gallery and Microphotography of Dr. Gary Greenberg. And I always use this around the 4th or the 14th of February when we do our meetings to make sure if the ladies are in there, we think about them. But you see all the different colors. All those different colors represent minerals. And so when you're near the ocean, a lot of those ocean soils are loaded with lots and lots of minerals, and you can see all the different colors. The greens are olivines, the pinks are potash bearing materials, as well as some of the micronutrients, the zincs, the manganese and such. The dark ones are more iron and such. On the right side is sand from Indiana Dunes State Park. And you see there's still a lot of different colors in there, especially we get a lot of the phosphorus minerals, as well as a lot of potash minerals and micronutrient minerals. Here's a picture of silt, which is basically sand breaking down into a smaller particle. And you can imagine now they're small particles, but they have holes in them. So they're kind of sandy, but they don't have much charge. They don't have any platy character, so they're not like clay. So they have some charge associated with them already. They let water move through very well unless they're really tightly packed. But this is what silt looks like underneath a microscope. It has a low CEC, so sands have really low CECs, and then silts are kind of moderately higher just because they do have a little more charge, but they don't hold water as well as clay particles, obviously. And air moves through these if the aggregates aren't packed too tightly. So the silt hills down in southwest Indiana along the western border of the state along the Wabash, and even down, in the Ohio River Valley, the White River Valley, where silt was blowing around for years and years, you'll see a lot of silt hills. They're almost entirely silt, very, very high silt contents. So the CECs are kind of low. They don't hold much, but they're pretty nice soils to work with. And then for those of us who are in my area, and in parts of Indiana, all the river valleys, and in parts of northeast Indiana, southeast Indiana, and parts of southwest Indiana, there's a lot of illite. This is clay. And these clay basically are down in the picture you're looking at here is about 20 micrometers. If you look down in the middle there, you got these two little lines on the end of it. That represents 20 micrometers. That's about 1,000 times smaller than the tip of the pencil. And this is what the clay plates, as they get finer and finer silts and break down into smaller pieces and start to develop each other, that's what these things are, clay plates. And this is where a lot of charge is held. And you can imagine these are very, very tiny holes. And liquid is in here, and nutrient is flowing around in here, and microbes live here. This is their home in some cases, all these holes in small places. So this is what the picture looks like. If you're on western Indiana, on the prairie soils, you'll see more montmorillonite clays or spectite clays, and you'll see there's a lot more fluffy character to these. These are the ones that really shrink and swell very widely. And on the right side, you've got almost smectites, which are almost like just giant, almost sheets on your bed. I mean, they're just huge. And so they tighten down very tightly and make great big holes. And then when they open up, they swell like crazy. Here's what that clay looks like. And so you can see some of the elements that I have listed there. That this is a picture from a book that I found, or maybe I think this was on the internet. But some of these clay minerals, we call them 1-to-1. That means they bond together. They don't really shrink and swell. So the old kaolinite clays of red clay down in southern Indiana, down into Kentucky, down on into the southeast, they don't shrink and swell very much. They're tightly bound to each other, and nothing actually gets in the middle between these plates. Whereas we get into the illites or the micas, the muscovites, and the smectites or the montmorillonites that we're talking about, when they shrink and swell really wide, that's when some of these elements can get stuck inside. So when you have wet soils and they're opening up, they're releasing lots of fertility. When they get dry, they shrink down. We call these 2-to-1 clay minerals, and they shrink down and they tie up some of that nutrition on the inside of that clay, as well as also inside when they formed these clay plates years ago. There's things trapped inside. But as a result, this is one of the reasons why when we have these illite clays, these muscovite clays, smectites, and montmorillonites, when we get rainfall, we release nutrition, just because when it opens back up, some of those nutrients can come back out. So chemistry is a huge part, if you don't realize, a huge part of everything that we practice in our business, as well as, buying and selling, and even the physical situations. Now, if you look at the different quantities of silt, sand, and clay, or if you look at your local county soils book, you can actually find out what your soil types are. It gives you the idea. This is a textural triangle. It tells you, one side is silt, one side is sand, one side is clay. You bring the percentages. And this is when I say, do you have a silt loam? I'm referring to that corner down there to the lower right, not the silts. That's almost 90 or 100% silt. But a silt loam has those kind of pieces in it. So it's soft and fluffy and flowery. You might feel a little grit in there and might have a little clay. But when you get more clay in there than about 30%, you jump into the silty clay loam, because it starts to get sticky and it sticks together. And if it's really, really flowery and really, really sticky, it's a silty clay. So these are just things that I use all the time that we used to teach with basic soils. And gosh, people don't even know what they even mean anymore. So a little bit of information a lot of times makes the guys feel better. If we add a little bit of organic matter and biology from the atmosphere to the aggregates that you've got now, the sand, the silt, and the clay, and we put a little life in it and give it a little bit of this stuff, since we've got a battery, and now we have some life and some ability to feed that life with organic matter and hold some more water, we've got an agriculturally productive soil. And so when seeds are in there and they begin to germinate, all kinds of new things happen. And soil is alive, and it needs to be alive. Soil that's dead still has some redeeming character, but not a lot, because soil is a living, breathing entity. It's a giant recycler and a converter. It recycles things that come in contact with it back into available fertility. That's its job, because plants are growing in those soils. It's the soil's job with the biology to convert rocks, organic matter, and minerals held in an unavailable form to stuff that's available. And it also has the ability to store some of those elements. How is it accomplished? Well, it's a natural process that involves those soil microbes, biochemistry from those microbes, and some simple electricity. So when we say the soil properties are interdependent, this is what we're talking about. So if you've got the physical condition of the soil, the biological condition of the soil, and the chemical condition of the soil, where they're all interacting, that sweet center spot is really what you're after. And getting good combinations of all that working together, tillage or aeration, getting moisture, or getting air into the soil, biology working into the soil, which actually releases nutrients from the soil, and the chemistry in the soil, how many nutrients and other things that we go into this with chemical inputs and other pieces. If the chemistry is balanced and the biology likes it, it makes the physical condition of the soil better. We call that soil health, soil tilth. That's what's going on in our soils, where we see the side ditches and the fence rows, and where we've no-tilled for a long time and we see better condition. That's the sweet spot that's in the center. So all these pieces, the ratio of the good guy microbes to bad guy microbes. If we have way too much clay and we can't get air in the soil, we typically till it a little bit, but we don't want to till it within an inch of its life to get some conditions. All of these things interact with each other, and one influences the other. And so what we're after is trying to get a very, very good center point in this. So organic matter in the soil, when it goes into that soil, adds to the cation exchange capacity, the CEC. What is CEC? Well, basically, we said cations are positively charged elements. They have a positive charge. In the soil, the way the soil's built and the giant battery that forms, it's a very giant negatively charged battery. There are a few positive spots, but very few. It's a giant anion or negatively charged area, so cations stick to it. So when we actually run a soil test, if we flush out all the cations, we can measure how many total cations that it holds, and it gives us a number, and we express that as cation exchange capacity. We said cation is just simply a positively charged element. So what is the overall charge of the battery on the soil, the clay, and the organic matter that make up that exchange capacity? Is it positive or negative? Well, I already gave that away. It's negative. So soils have a very small anion exchange capacity, that positive charge on the soil that actually gets attracted, like so something like a nitrate that has a negative, or a sulfate that has a negative, or a borate that has a negative. They can stick a little bit from time to time, but not very much. It's a very, very low, small percentage of that. So that's why the nitrates and the sulfates and the borates leach away. They're negatively charged, and since they have nowhere to stick, unless they stick to something else, another element that's in the solution on the way out and happen to get stuck somewhere, they're not going to stay in solution. They're going to wash away. Boron or borates are the most easily washed away, followed by sulfates and nitrates. So we don't really measure that anion exchange capacity as a result. That's why you wouldn't see an anion exchange capacity listed on a soil test. Organic matter is also a complex of life, death, food, elements, moisture, and air. The combination of all those variables determines the viability and the productivity of your soil. And so there is a perfect center spot. If you had so much sand, so much soil, so much water, so much organic matter. And why are we concerned about all this soil life? Why is it important? We have all these other physical things going on. Well, it's because the living microbes in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, the mycorrhiza, the actinomycetes, they're responsible for the release of natural fertility present in the soil. And believe it or not, for some of the breakdown of the old fertilizer. They're also responsible for escorting it properly into the plant. Believe it or not, many microbes actually help plants absorb their nutrition. So that makes it what we call bioavailable. So the actual natural process that goes on out in the woods, that went on in the prairie, that it's in the side ditch, or it's in your grass, and if you don't do anything to your grass and it continues to grow, it's because the biology is increasing. They increase the holding capacity and tilth of the soil as they work the soil, and they turn that soil into fluffier materials with organic stuff in it. We call that soil tilth. And typically as soil tilth increases, the holding capacity increases. If we looked at the composition, so this is part of a scientific document, the composition of soil, a 2 million pound plow layer, 6 2/3 inches to 8 inches deep, 1,000 tons. If you measured it, and this is what Halbus and Franklin and did up at North Dakota State, and this is, again, peer-reviewed information. So they found out that there's boatloads of stuff composition-wise in that 2 million pounds, that 1,000 tons of the acre furrow slice on top, including 2,600 pounds of potash in a sandy loam, 35,000 in a silt loam, and 40,000 in a clay loam. And this was standardized for several of them in North Dakota. In our area, we have as high as 50 to 60,000 pounds of potash in our illite soils. In our silt loams and silty clay loams and clay loams, we can have easily 30 to 60,000 pounds in the upper 6 to 8 inches. Now, we also have phosphate in very high numbers too. And then when you add phosphate to your soil, the phosphate that actually precipitates become a part of that soil, and you don't get it back. The Potash and Phosphate Institute and the Tennessee Valley Authority had told us over the years, if you get more than 50% of the phosphate that you've bought as fertilizer and put it in the soil, into your plants, into the system, in your lifetime, you're above average. Because if you're not using biology, if you're tilling all the time and not using biology, a lot of that material is tying up. And even some of the chemistry, even without tillage, is tying up. So you've added thousands of pounds on top of the thousands that were there. It's the same with the micronutrients. There's several different things. And as you get into these soils in this area, we have lots and lots of micronutrients. And oftentimes, we haven't added micronutrients like we did the macros in the last several years. So if something's going to be limiting, oftentimes it's not so much the macronutrients, it's the micronutrients. This also is a scientific document. This document was designed as a result of the war effort back after World War II, with things laying around in terms of munitions, potash and phosphorus, especially both. They said, is there any way to actually mimic what the soil looks like to give us an idea of what the availability portion of those thousands and thousands of pounds of minerals, what is the available portion that we might be able to look at and see in this soil from place to place, to see whether or not there was an economic response to applying extra fertility. And that's the only thing that the government was asking for. They asked the land-grant universities to do some of these things and come up with ideas, and so they did. And so as a result, this is a scientific document that was formed as well. That was a situation where we put salts, acids, different things in there into the soil to cause it to extract the stuff that was available so we could kind of measure it. And when we measured that, of course, you remember there were letters on that. This particular one doesn't have the letters anymore. The letters might have been VL, L, M, H, and VH. Those referred to the level of the available portion of those minerals that was showing up when the test was run. And all those letters meant was if the phosphorus was in the VL category, very low, then there's a strong chance that a person could get a response to adding phosphorus to their soil. At no point then or now have those numbers ever been correlated directly to yield, and they never will be, because all of this is dependent on air and water, temperature, biological activity, and whatever nutrients they find in the solution. But just because the numbers say something good on a soil test does not mean that you're going to have X, Y, or Z for the yields. And people have not understood this through the years. And it's one of the reasons why this whole business has gotten completely out of whack through the years, is because we think if we make those numbers on a test look like this, bam, we deserve a crop that comes off and yields like this. And trust me, it makes you think good because you're buying these things that things are going to happen that way, but it doesn't. And so I have seen soil tests that would make a man that had a prime farm shame himself and turn red, and see those farms out yield the ones that had the highest numbers on his soil test report. And you want to talk about frustrating and an interesting conversation, have that one day when it happens. Now, on this particular situation, we measure different elements in different ways with different extractants, and there's a whole science, in a sense, to reading a soil test report. And I want to do one just on a soil test report for you guys so that you can do it, but I'm not going to take the time to do it with this one today. But realize what I was trying to get at in this whole situation was the previous one is the total composition in hundreds or thousands of pounds, and this tells you of those hundreds of thousands of pounds what appears to be available or nearly available for plants to be able to kind of pick them up. And microbial activity has a huge influence on this. So if you actually did go back to that test and say, okay, Dan, here's what my numbers look like. On the far right side, you see percent base saturation, percent K for potassium, percent Mg for magnesium, percent calcium, or percent Ca for calcium, percent H is hydrogen. So the percent Na is sodium, and we don't measure that in this part of the country typically because most of it is leached away. So the bases, the basic or the alkali cations, are the potassium, magnesium, and calcium, along with, in some cases, some of those metals. Hydrogen is an acidic cation, so we don't calculate it in the base saturation, and it's almost the exact opposite. So when we add up potassium at 3.2, magnesium at 22.1, and calcium at 55.3, you can see we'd have what, 77, 80, 80.6. 80.6 minus 100 is what? 19.4. So 80.6% of that soil is made up with basic or alkaline cations, and 19.4% of it is acidic cations. So you've got a fair amount of acid in the soil. So of the exchange capacity, 15.1 being its number, 80.6% of that number would actually be basic or alkaline. Okay, so the pH is kind of moderately acid. If you go over to the pH column, well, there you are. pH 5.8, which is actually moderately acid in that soil solution. So this makes sense. So again, a lot of stuff to figure out. But one of the things that don't get tested frequently enough is the micronutrients now. And as we start looking at the micronutrients, it's a whole different world. But the micronutrients oftentimes are what the guys that are growing the really, really high yields anymore are picking up upon. There are 18 elements that are essential, not just 3 or 5. And as they start to marry these things together, wow, things begin to happen. So if we did have our soil test and we were looking at what would be optimum on that soil test for cation exchange capacity and the balance, what we're looking at for the balance is how much calcium, how much magnesium, how much potassium would be good. This is for both nutrient sufficiency now and air water management. This is what throws people. It's not always about the nutrients and the sufficiency. It's about air water management, and calcium and magnesium together, when they're on these clays that shrink and swell, determine how far apart they swell, how big they swell, how much water's stuck in them. And so it's not about how much calcium and magnesium you're going to get in your plant. It's the condition of the soil and how well water moves around in it. So what would be a target? Well, for most of the soils, we have a range about 60 to 75%. As you have more and more sand, you get probably closer down to 60%. As you have more clay, you want to be up closer to 75%. Optimum for corn in most of these situations, if you had a soil, would be around 70% for most soils. Magnesium, if you're on the sands, you want to be closer to 20%. Magnesium is a smaller ion than calcium, and it holds water in a very, very large shell. Unfortunately, it doesn't let it go very easy. So to hold more water in a sand, you have to have more magnesium. So they're almost just the opposite. So in a soil with sand, you want 60 to 65% calcium and closer to 20% magnesium. In a clay that's going to shrink and swell a lot, you don't want all that water in there. So you'd rather hold that to 75% calcium and 10% magnesium. So they're kind of inverse of each other. Potassium, 2 to 5%, with an optimum being somewhere around 4. If we get too much potassium in corn, which I hate to see some of the guys that are out here telling people we need 6, 7, 8% these days, some corn hybrids are not going to tolerate that. And it doesn't mean that you're going to grow bad corn, but you're never going to grow top corn on high potash levels. So in most of these soils, I try to shoot for somewhere around 3 to 3.5% base saturation to keep me in a very optimal range and not get so little that we don't get the job done and not get so much that it takes the top off of our crop. Sodium, if you had it 0 to 2%, we don't see much in that area around here. And it's a good idea to have a little, but not much. The ammonium ion and the traces, the trace minerals is what I'm referring to there, the micronutrients, about 1%. Now, hydrogen, which is acid. A lot of guys, you'll be told by your local suppliers, get rid of all your acid. That's a no-no, because you have to understand acid melts metals, and microbes need some acid to do some of the work that they do. And when you actually take these soils back to neutral on a pH range, we're going from 0 to 14, where 7 is in the middle and 7 is kind of neutral. The electrical charge in there and everything gets stagnant right about pH 7, where you've got neutral. If you've ever seen where you do vinegar and baking soda, you pour baking soda into vinegar and all of a sudden it gets really eruptive and it's violent and it lets off all kinds of bubbles and everything. And then when it's all said and done, if you go down in the bottom where you've had an acid-base reaction, there's a precipitate, a form down in the bottom, like we talked about a while ago with the phosphate, the precipitation. There's a precipitate down in the bottom. If you put that down in there and you put it on your finger and you taste it, it doesn't have any zing. It doesn't taste like anything. It's neutralized. So when you put vinegar on your tongue, that's zingy. When you put baking soda on your tongue, that's zingy. But when you mix vinegar together, they neutralize each other and you taste what's formed and there's no zing anymore. So you want some hydrogen, some acid in your soil to help melt out some of the copper, zinc, manganese, and iron, the metals, to also help melt out a little more phosphate if you can. And so you want about 10 to 15%, somewhere around 12% would be optimum. If you do this and you get these numbers where I just told you, you will have a balanced soil. You'll have some acid in there and your pH will be about 6.3, which is huge in the big picture. You'll see this here in a few minutes why. But this will have a properly balanced soil with a good pH, that's what that soil should look like if you want to try to get it to optimally work for you. What are these each individual pieces? So if we go to that soil test, and here's the arrow, if you look underneath there, the arrow is pointing to the cation exchange capacity box. We talked about that a while ago. A cation section, nutrients that are positively charged when taken up by the plant. So the CEC stands for the exchange capacity, the indicator of how much fertility that soil can hold. Sandy soils have low holding capacities. And so when you can make soils and sands change dramatically by putting fertilizer, you can change the numbers all day long. It's easy to change them because they don't hold much, and you're constantly throwing different fertilizers to them. They don't hold much, the plants take them up, and you can change them. Clays, on the other hand, have numbers way up in the 15, 25, and I deal with some up as high as 45 to 50 in some other parts of the northern part of the country with heavy clay. So silt loams are stuck in the middle, somewhere between 7 and about 12 to 14. You'll have silt loams or heavy silt loams or light silty clay loams. So the number is what it is. You're not necessarily going to change it. It's just what it is. So you'll know the soil type and it'll have a number associated with it. And the test will show you what that number is. Then if we go to calcium on the far right there, not completely far to the right, percent Ca, calcium is an indicator of how much available soil water that soil will hold and the flocculation or the tilthiness potential of that soil, of the soil clays. So it holds a lot more water with magnesium, but magnesium won't let it go. So calcium, if it's in a very high situation, holds water and lets the water be available to biology and also to a plant. Soils that are high in magnesium are really sticky, wet, sloppy. They're nasty, nasty soils. And those you guys who have high mag soils, you know what I'm talking about. So calcium is an indicator of what the good soil water potential is of a clay. Magnesium, on the other hand, is an indicator of how much excess soil water that the soil is going to hold and the tightness or low oxygen condition of that soil clay. So if it's always full of water and got the clays constantly swelling, there's very low air. And you'll realize that once you put too much magnesium in there and there's not much air and you can't drive biology, it seems like those soils, you typically buy lots and lots and lots of more fertility to try to get the work done because the soil can't breathe. Well, that's right. So if you can get rid of some of that magnesium and make it go away and open it up a little bit, wow, things change dramatically. What about the potassium? So you see it's under the potassium, the percent K. Potassium is an indicator of how much extra nitrogen you may need to optimize crop growth. Also contributes to a little bit to the tightness of the soil clays. As we run lots and lots of potash into these systems, we run a lot more water. As we run a lot more water into the plant, we need a lot more nitrogen to get the same job done, because when we run water into the plant's a sugar machine. And when we dilute those sugars, they're less efficient. So we have to do a whole lot more with a lot of extra fertility. So when we run potash way, way high, we also have to run nitrogen way, way high. And it's like, wow, if we just backed off and did some other things, another clue is if you use more boron and you flow more sugar, you don't need as much potash. If you don't need as much potash, you don't need as much nitrogen. Boy, don't you wish you had that written down again so we could go through it. I'll say it one more time. If you have more boron in your plant, you flow more sugar. If you flow more sugar, you only need a little water to move those sugars around. So you don't need as much potassium to get the same amount of work done if you have higher levels of boron. Once you have too much potassium in there, you got to run higher levels of nitrogen. It just ends up getting more and more expensive. So one of the strategies we have around here is helping people understand how to use boron. Hydrogen. On the far right column, hydrogen is the indicator of how much acid you have in the soil. It also indicates micronutrient availability due to solubility, because acid will physically melt metals. So as your pH in your soil, in this particular instance, you go over and the pH is 5.6. As your pH gets down into the mid to lower 5s and acid is building, your zinc, your manganese, your iron, your copper, being metals, begin to melt. And the other thing that melts, obviously, too, is because we talked about it earlier in the program, phosphorus. So if we have lots and lots of phosphorus and we begin to get low pHs and the phosphorus starts to melt and we started melting those metals, well, if we take zinc and put it next to phosphate, oh man, we form zinc phosphate. So we have to be cautious that we don't oversupply phosphorus to these soils and get them so high in phosphate that if we let the acid come down, we do that to help the minerals melt, but we kick ourselves in the seat of the pants if we have too much phosphate. This is why in soils that are high in pH, that tie up the metals and have high phosphorus, any metals that get released up there at high pH, the alkaline pH, they get tied up and down here on the low end. So you're going to see when I talked about 6.3 a while ago, you're going to see where this all comes to play in. So there are 18 essential elements, guys. The question then becomes, if you didn't put them there, all 18, where'd they come from? Go back to the composition and you'll begin to understand that. If they are all there, then why do we only shouldn't we look at the overall numbers are? And the answer is yes. When we get to soil pH and nutrient availability, this chart you may have seen before, this helps us understand that we're at different pH as there's more availability. Well, look at that. Right around pH 3, where I said a while ago, is the optimum range for most of these nutrients. When we're looking at the big picture of pHs, most of the widest quantity is available consistently at about pH 6.3. So if we can maintain good balance and a pH of 6.3, we will have our soil working in fighting us. Try so difficultly to help people understand that you should not get rid of all the acid in the soil. That's a no-no. If you go over to 7, look what happens as you get in there to boron and manganese and iron and copper and zinc. A lot of those begin to tie up, even phosphorus. You know, pH 7 is already on the tie-up curve again on the way up towards 8, and then again it changes at higher pHs. So, and if we get way down too low into the 5s, then you can see some of these things really start to change dramatically and go the other way too. So pH 6.3 is a key indicator of some things happening. The further impacts of pH on a soil. Well, the pH also determines the activity of the microbes in the soil. If you understand where this is going, there are bacteria and fungi in the soil, beneficial as well as detrimental. And when we look at most of the stuff that we look at in bacteriology, where we study bacteria get their biggest bang for the buck in more alkaline conditions. They grow faster because they need calcium, and when they have calcium at higher pH conditions, they need them to make their cell walls. So as a result, they can build populations easier in more alkaline conditions. So let's say 6.8, 7, 7.2, 7.5, whatever. They're better there. So they love that higher pH condition, higher base saturation of calcium. They prefer alkaline conditions. However, fungus are very good at dissolving tissues. When we think of fungi, we think of things like maybe Rhizoctonia, Pythium, Phytophthora, Diplodia, Fusarium. They are what we call stalk rots and root rots and different things. Rots dissolve tissues. They are very good at dissolving the tissues, and they need micronutrient metals to make the enzymes that allow them to do their work. So their enzyme systems are dependent on getting micronutrients. If that's the case, and they need micronutrient metals out of the soil solution, which pH range would they naturally prefer? And the answer is acidic conditions. Okay, so if you understand that, if we go back to what we just showed you here previously, if we have the maximum amount of nutrient availability at pH 6.3, and we have enough acid to do the work to melt the metals right in that 6.3 range, and there's enough alkalinity, calcium and other things available, if we have good calcium levels with a balance of magnesium and potassium and this magic number of 6.3, then air and water is exchanging. Biology is working in both the fungal and the alkaline range, the bacterial range. Everybody's getting along, doing all the work they can do at an optimal output. So what we've done is we've balanced the soil chemically and biologically, And now we're getting the soil to give up the best things it can give us in conjunction with our fertility program. And that's what this is all about. And this is where we start seeing soil health, soil tilth, and the chemistry and the biology and the physical condition of the soil all coming to bear in helping us get where we want to go. And the people who've been doing this for a long, long time will tell you they didn't understand it when they started. It's a lot to grasp. I recognize that. Don't apologize for it. But once you begin to understand this, things don't make us as concerned from time to time when we see things on a test that scare us. Maybe it's a little too low in pH. Well, not necessarily. Let's make sure the calcium and the magnesium and the potassium are balanced, and that there's good air water management. And even when we put tile in here, if we drain this out and get air to come in, sometimes the soil test changed dramatically, because if there was a lot of water and microbes couldn't work, but now that water's gone and the microbes are working like crazy, all of a sudden the soil tissue or the soil test changes, and the tissue test will change on the plants growing in those soils. And lo and behold, they start yielding like crazy because they finally got some air and we took away the physical problems. I guess we never really apologize for helping people learn a lot new things. It is fun and frustrating at the same time, but it's part of learning, and it seems like 60% of our time is helping people with just that, learning. So this is the kind of official end of section 1 of our presentation, and if you have questions, please get a hold of us. You can get a hold of your representative at his first name at spnccorp.com. That's 2 C's in the center. So if it was me, for instance, Dan at spnccorp.com, or your representative, whether it's Drew or Chase or Colt. Or you can dial us at the main number at 260-478-8080. That's the main office number. And of course, some of this stuff will always be available at spnccorp.com.